Chapter 13. The Glowing Twilight. In December 1913, Sarah Bernhardt scored another hit with a play called Jean Doré by humorist Tristan Bernard. There was nothing very humorous about this drama, however. In it she played the mother of a youth condemned to death for murdering a man who has seduced the girl he loves. The final scene takes place outside the prison cell the night before his execution. The mother comes to exchange a few final words with her son. Having to communicate in the dark through the barred peephole of his door, the boy fails to recognize his mother, thinks she's his faithless girl who has returned to him, and pours out his love in a torrent of impassioned words, while the mother keeps silent and never disillusions him. As the stricken women, Sarah was superbly poignant. On March 16th, 1914, Sarah Bernhardt, at long last, was made a Chevalier of the Légion d'honneur. The presentation ceremony took place on the stage following a performance, and beforehand there was a great excitement in the house. Everyone in the company knew about it, and the ushers, as they seated people, murmured breathlessly, "Did you know that Madame is to be decorated tonight?" During the intermissions, the audience rushed out and denuded the neighboring flower stalls. At the finish of the performance, bouquets were pelted across the footlights, and one inspired enthusiast hurled a streamer of red ribbon symbolic of the ruban rouge, which wafted down gracefully at Sarah's feet. The final curtain fell. The cast and theater personnel gathered on stage, and a government emissary came forward, pinned on her France's most coveted medal, and gave her the accolade on either cheek. Accolade. During the brief ritual, she stood, head held high, with a proud and youthful stance, as though she were playing l'aiglon. Afterwards she tried to speak, but the words would not come forth. The tears, however, did, and with golden dignity she hobbled off to her dressing room. It was fortunate that Jean Doré was making money, for as always she was in need of it. Her expenses were as heavy as ever, her economies non-existent, and during past months a necklace, a pin, or a ring had more than once been exchanged for cash at the Mont de Piété. She made no bones about this. "I can't see anything shameful in saying one has pawned one's jewelry," she said. "It's borrowing from the government, and you pay enormous interest." She had made her son director-manager of the theater Sarah Bernhardt at a salary he hardly warranted. Maurice was 50 by now, a distinguished-looking man with prematurely gray hair. He had married again, but that hadn't improved his sense of responsibility, possibly because he didn't have any to improve. He was still a spendthrift, still an inveterate gambler. A special telephone in the box office had a direct line to the star's dressing room. Sometimes it would ring during an intermission, and the agitated voice of the ticket seller would be heard saying, "Madame Sarah, Monsieur Maurice is here, and he wants us to hand tonight's receipts over to him. What shall we do?" And in a tone of hollow weariness, Madame Sarah would answer, "Let him have them." After a profitable tour of the provinces with Jean Doré in the early summer of 1914, she went for a vacation in Belle Isle with her family, her son and his wife, Lisiane and Simone, who had come across from England with her young offspring. Suzanne Saylor was in attendance, and the old guard was on hand. Clarin, old Geoffrey, and Louise Abema. Everyone was enjoying a favorite pursuit, and existence seemed as happy and serene as the smiling Brittany sky. On June 29th, they were all relaxing in the sanatorium when Emile came puffing back from town with the usual overload of provender and the day-old Paris papers. It was the custom for Suzanne Saylor to read excerpts of news aloud each day to Madame Sarah. That afternoon, she read of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie in a place named Sarajevo. Amid the peace of Belle Isle, the tragic incident seemed like distant melodrama. It was sad, of course, but how could one be seriously concerned about what happened in the Balkans? The Balkans came considerably nearer when 1 month later, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. And when on July 29th the German Kaiser declared war on Russia, menacing clouds seemed to darken the Brittany sky, and the vacationers on the Pointe de Poulaines became tense with unspoken forebodings. On August 1st, Bernhardt, in a fever for news and unable to make the 9-kilometer carriage trip into the little town, dispatched Lisanne and Simone to find out what they could. They raced off in the trap and joined the crowd of townspeople and fisherfolk who were staring with apprehensive disbelief at an official proclamation posted on the door of the mayor's house. It was President Poincaré's order for general mobilization. With heavy hearts, the young women drove back to convey the grim tidings to Great. Lisanne writes that her reaction was to murmur heartbrokenly, "Dear God, why does civilization keep on receding? Each war, even if one, is a fresh defeat to our intelligence." 3 days later, across the Channel, Sir Edward Grew uttered his prophecy. "The lights are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." The Belle Isle holiday came abruptly to an end, and Madame Bernhardt returned to Paris with her entourage. During the next month, news from the front was worse each day. Belgium had been devastated, and the Boche had crossed the frontier into French territory. Some units had penetrated to the outlying towns of Compiègne and Meaux, Meaux, moo, and each day, how do cows moo in French? Moo. Okay, and each day the massed hordes of spike-helmeted, gray-uniformed men advanced implacably. The occupation of Paris seemed inevitable. Barricades were set up in the streets, and the government, considering discretion the better part of valor, moved its headquarters to Bordeaux. Bernhardt's friends implored her also to get out of the city, but she flatly refused to, saying that she'd remained there during 1807 and she had no intentions of running away in 1914. In early September, a man from the War Ministry called with an official request that Madame Sarah Bernhardt leave the capital and take up residence in a safer part of the country. It has been said that this had been brought about indirectly by her good friend Georges Clemenceau. The Tiger of France was then running an outspoken newspaper called L'Homme Libre, the Free Man, a name which after strict wartime censorship curtailed its editorials. He changed into L'Homme en Chaîne, the Man in Chains. Through influential sources, Clemenceau, who had access to certain espionage reports, had found out that Sarah Bernhardt's name was on the list of hostages the Kaiser wanted brought to Berlin as soon as Paris fell. Sarah was amused by the thought of being on a hostage list. She was also rather flattered, but she couldn't take it seriously. Then the man from the War Ministry appealed to her on the grounds that she was a national figure for whose safety her country could take no risks. A persuasive argument which worked with the lady, and she decided to leave shortly for Andernos-les-Bains in the Gironde. They were to go by train. The morning of her departure, she sent Emile out to hail a taxi. After a considerable time, he returned with the news that there were no taxis to be had. Maurice, who had also gone in search, came back with the same information. Finally, a battered old vehicle was rounded up and family and baggage crowded in. Madame Sarah had to sit with her leg stretched out before her, as by now the doctors had resorted to the drastic therapy of immobilizing her entire limb in a plaster cast, with the dismal fear that she might never again see Paris intact in all its loveliness. She told the driver to go by way of the Champs-Élysées. Turning onto the gracious thoroughfare, they were confronted with the astonishing sight of countless lumbering camions, and following them as far as one could see, line after line of taxis loaded with soldiers. These turned out to be those intrepid taxis of Paris that transported an entire battalion of reinforcements to the Fifth Army, bringing about the miracle of the Marne. Liziane tells that an officer stopped their driver and demanded why he hadn't lined up his machine with the others. Opening the door, he ordered the occupants to get out then and there. Then he stopped short, she writes, his eyes fixed on Sarah Bernhardt, who was listening without saying a word, her poor leg rigidly stretched out. The officer raised his hand to his kepi and saluted. I beg your pardon, madame. I didn't know. Go, chauffeur. Chauffeur, take Madame Sarah Bernhardt to the station. Then come back and put yourself at our disposition. Then he turned a second time to my grandmother. Go with a tranquil mind, madam. They shall not pass. Ooh. They spent the next 5 months in a pine-surrounded villa overlooking the tranquil bay of Arcachon. The stay was anything but tranquil for Madame Sarah. She, the normally physical stoic, at times cried out in agony. An eminent Dr. Pozzi, who was a good friend, journeyed down from Paris and removed the cast, only to discover that gangrene had developed and was rapidly spreading. Sarah, everyone knew that amputation was inevitable. Pozzi balked at doing it himself. So did another physician, who refused to perform so drastic an operation on a woman approaching 72 who suffered from chronic uremia. Physicians were scarce, and most of them having enlisted in the medical corps. Finally, a Dr. Denousse in nearby Bordeaux agreed to undertake the risky job. In the bleak early morning of February 22nd, 1915, Liziane Maurice, Suzanne Saylor, and Clarin sat silent and stricken-faced in the hospital waiting room. The stretcher bearing their adored Sarah paused briefly at the entrance. She waved at them cheerfully, called out, Allons, enfants, un peu de courage. Then with mock bravado she hummed the opening bars of the Marseillaise as she was wheeled on down the corridor. News of the Bernhardt calamity flashed about the globe, and messages of condolence swamped the Bordeaux postes et telegraphes. One gruesome communication came from the impresario of the P.T. Barnum Freak Show, who cabled an offer of $10,000 to display the severed leg in its exhibition. Convalescence was long and critical, and for a time Madame Sarah's life hung in the balance. Slowly, however, her strength returned and she was able to try a wooden leg. Her own had been taken off high up on the thigh, almost at the hip, and the artificial contrivance that was sent had to be attached by means of a heavy girdle that fitted about her hips and stomach. Never in her life had she worn any sort of corset, and she didn't intend to now. After trying unsuccessfully to attach the cumbersome contraption by some other means, she flew into one of her old rages and ordered the thing to be thrown into the fire. The public speculated as to how Madame Sarah would go about from now on. The majority believed she'd wear a wooden leg. Some thought she'd depend upon crutches. An outrageous quip is attributed to the usually kind Tristan Bernard when he attended the first performance she gave after the amputation. Upon hearing the 3 hammer strokes on wood signaling the rise of the curtain, he remarked to his companion, Dance, here she comes. She never made any attempt to try crutches, and the idea of a wheelchair filled her with contempt. What did they take her for? She snorted. An ancient invalid. Her solution was a specially designed litter chair with 2 horizontal shafts by which she could be borne about. She stipulated that it be finished in Louis XV style, painted white and ornamented with gilt carving on the sides. Being Sarah Bernhardt, she dramatized the situation wherever she was carried, assuming the attitude of an empress in a procession. Again, there were outrageous quips from the insensitive boulevard wags, certain of whom nicknamed her Marie Lachaise. Marie Lachaise, M-E with the on it, R-E, Lachaise. Elizabeth Finlay Thomas watched her being taken through her stage door. her arms full of roses, the shining fuzz of her hair crowned with the usual capote of flowers. Her mutilated figure a mass of velvets. She was the personification of undaunted courage. If people had any idea that Sarah Bernhardt was finished as an actress, she was going to show them quand même. She returned to Paris in October 1915. The Germans having fallen back sufficiently to mitigate the risk of her being taken as a hostage, although the idea still rather intrigued her. Soon after she was back, she put on a bill of 3 one-act plays and appeared in the final one, which was a sort of tableau with dialogue. This was Les Cathedrales by Eugene Morand, a piece described as a scenic poem in which various actresses, symbolizing the chief cathedrals of France, recited heroic couplets about the patrie, la gloire, the recovery of Alsace-Lorraine, and further sentiments calculated to wring tears and cheers from a wartime audience. The last tableau revealed Sarah as the embodiment of Strasbourg Cathedral, enthroned on a dais. She remained almost motionless as she uttered a long speech. Then at the end she raised her arms and in some superhuman way also raised herself until she was standing on her one leg, managing to balance by leaning against the heavy arm of the chair, and her voice in all its power rang forth, "Ha! Pleurez, pleurez, allemand, l'anglais allemand est tombé dans des rings." That was, I have no idea. Sarah Bernhardt had shown her sacred monster. Sarah Bernhardt had shown her sacred monster that she was anything but finished. In 1914, the popular prediction had been, "The men will be out of the trenches by Christmas." But the war went on, week after week, month after month, and more men slogged it out or perished in the mud and misery of those trenches. Early in 1915, the Theatre aux Armées was organized by an enterprising group of actors and actresses for the purpose of sending performers up behind the lines to entertain the wily poilus. Oh, I missed the pleurez allemand, l'anglais allemand est tombé dans des rings. There's an asterisk. So, weep, weep, Germany. The German eagle has fallen into the Rhine. So, Sarah Bernhardt was fired with the idea that she, too, would travel to the Western Front and carry her art, if necessary, into the trenches themselves. The authorities were aghast, but at her insistence finally agreed to send her. They stipulated, however, that she must go in company with another player, and they appointed Béatrix Duzan. Duzan was then one of the youngest comediennes at the Comédie Française. In future years, she was to become one of the leading authorities on the French theater. Duzan was discouraged by the instructions that she must accompany great Sarah. She, with her flowers, her furs, her luxuries of a sovereign, and her fragility. She had never met Bernhardt personally and felt considerably awed when she was summoned to the Boulevard Pereire to go over plans. In her book, Reines de Theatre, she wrote that she was ushered into a white boudoir, where I see in the depths of a huge armchair an extraordinary creature, 1,000 rumples of satin and lace topped with a tousled red coiffure, ageless features whose wrinkles are caked over with makeup. An impression upsetting and a bit sad. She seemed so small, so damaged, the great, the radiant Sarah, a little heap of cinders. Then Duzan goes on to say, they started going over their prospective program, and the Bernhardt miracle took place. For 2 hours, the little heap of cinders never stopped emitting sparks. I feel this has occurred ever since she came into this world, and it will continue forever. Beneath the painted and tinseled decrepitude of the old actress there burns an inextinguishable sun. A few days later, the two boarded a train at the Gare de l'Est. Military regulations forbade any of Madame's customary entourage to go along. Even the men who carried either end of her litter chair were hired porters, trainmen, and eventually delegated poilus. During the journey, she laughed and chatted gaily. They got off at Toul and motored over a rutted road to a nearby town half shuttered by bombs. Half shattered by bombs. The first performance was in an open marketplace where a crude stage had been set up. Makeshift footlights flickered uncertainly, and a flimsy curtain flapped sporadically in the chill gusts of a damp wind. The audience, seated on benches or squatting on the ground, was made up of over 2,000 men. Wounded men, men fresh out of action, men about to go for the first time into hell, the hell of vermin-infested trenches, barbed wire, no man's land, and mustard gas. Dusan and a few others performed their acts first. Then it was announced that they were about to see Madame Sarah Bernhardt. The announcement met with dead silence. The flimsy curtain fluttered open to reveal a wisp of an aging woman propped against pillows in a shabby armchair. Then the wisp of a woman began to speak the lines of the patriotic piece she had selected, and the miracle again took place. Sarah, old, mutilated, once more illuminated a crowd by the rays of her genius. This fragile creature, ill, wounded, and immobile, could still, through the magic of her spoken word, re-instill heroism in those soldiers weary from battle. When she wound up her recitation with the clarion, "Armes!" the 2,000 men rose to their feet, cheering and some of them sobbing. In 3 days they performed in 6 other villages, some of them less than a half-mile from Argonne and Verdun. They recited in barns, in hospital wards, in mess tents, and on the terrace of a deserted chateau. Living accommodations were primitive, but Bernhardt's verve never flagged. They shared the same room, Dusan helping the cripple maneuver as best she could. Sarah had become remarkably adept at hopping, and as she'd make her way from bed to washstand, she'd crow with laughter and say, "Look, I'm a guinea hen! I'm a guinea hen!" Dusan sums her up. An old woman heroically and insanely determined to ignore time, pain, and physical laws, smiling and joking to forestall being pitied, shedding on the public the warmth of a radiance that never goes out. Greater perhaps in this glowing twilight than in the sparkling days of her apogee. A number of weeks later, accompanied by Lysiane, she went on another mission for the Theatre aux Armées, playing in 3 towns along the Marne. At Reims, she was placed on a platform outside the semi-shattered cathedral, and the soldiers had the thrill of hearing her recite her Strasbourg speech from Les Cathedrales. She insisted upon going to Pont-à-Mousson on the Moselle, a site shelled daily by the enemy, but no bomb happened to fall that particular day. At one point, she told a general that she wanted to recite for the men in the front-line trenches. The general, somewhat taken aback, said he couldn't give her permission unless he accompanied her. "But wouldn't the Boche recognize your rank and fire?" she asked. "Probably," he answered. "Then let us go back," she said. "France has need of her generals." A later reply she made to Lord Kitchener was in the same vein of histrionics. She'd been playing a brief engagement in London and wanted to return to France by the shorter route on a troop ship scheduled to land in Boulogne. She wrote Kitchener, whom she knew well, asking for a permit. Her letter was so highly perfumed it caused consternation in the War Office. The hero of Khartoum wrote back that he could not allow her to take such a risk, as that part of the channel was infested with enemy craft. "My lords," was her reaction, "it would be a matter of dying with our soldiers. Quelle gloire!" It would come as no surprise that in 1916 Sarah Bernhardt again was short on funds. She made 2 movies, those ridiculous photographed pantomimes, as she called them, one taken from Jean Doré and the other a war film called Mothers of France, both of which brought her in some money. But as always, her El Dorado lay in the United States. This was really to be her final farewell American tour. It was financially rewarding and physically backbreaking, lasting as it did for 18 months. Again, she appeared in scenes from her regular repertory, varying the bill with a few new one-act playlets, 2 by her son and 1 by herself. The best new item was Au Champs d'Honneur, a war piece written by a young soldier then serving in the French army. The setting is on a deserted area of the battlefield, and she impersonated a youthful standard bearer, a former actor and poet, mortally wounded yet determined to save his battalion's flag from enemy hands. I think we're coming back to this. I think we'll start here on the next one.